This is GAA Embedded here on Balls.ie, our usually weekly look back at the GAA Championship action, but it's a special show here on a Wednesday afternoon today because there's been some momentous GAA news in that one of the greatest hurlers of all time, the top scorer in Championship history as of last weekend, Joe Canning, has retired from inter-county hurling. He said it himself at a Borgosh Energy event earlier today. He just said, look, this decision was made. He spoke to the team after the game when they lost to Waterford on Saturday, and he's done with Galway. So quite a shock. One of the best players we've ever seen. I have a man who's a regular on GAA Embedded, living in Melbourne, Australia, but from the beautiful county of Galway hurling fan, and the man who's grown up with Joe Canning in the Galway team, Maurice Brosnan. Maurice, are you okay, first of all?
Oh, I'm hanging in there. Yeah. This, there was rumours. There was a lot of rumours going around on Monday, Mick, that he'd said something in the dressing room after, but didn't know really which would take him with a pinch of salt or not. And then, so despite the fact that there was some degree of anticipation this might be coming, I'm still kind of shocked and just kind of devastated, really.
Yeah, it is devastating. In a way, it's for the game and certainly for Galway fans. And I think it's important to kind of explain why Joe Canning is this figure. We will talk a little bit later on as well. Shane McGrath, a regular guest, is going to be with us a little bit later, as well as maybe a couple more that we're going to have on. But I wanted to get you on, Maurice, before it got too late in Melbourne, because Joe Canning burst on the scene as a 15-year-old. It was when I started hearing about this guy. And I remember even the Galway manager, I think it was Conor Hayes at the time, talking about, he was thinking about calling him into the team at 16 in 2006, 2007. We knew about Joe Canning before most of us ever seen him. But even when we did see him then, there was the year, he took an extra year, I remember, because he didn't want to rush into it straight out of minor, and eventually arrived in sort of 2008 on the scene. And you're kind of thinking, there's always that fear of disappointment with these guys, that they're never going to be what you expect them to be. But in many ways, Joe has even exceeded that expectation in the kind of overall career he's had. Obviously he didn't win 6 All-Irelands, or he didn't win, 15 All-Stars. He wasn't the best hurler in the country every year. But in an overall way, I think the fact that he delivered so consistently for 14 years in a way that, I don't know if I've ever seen that before. You can talk about Shefflin, and you can talk about a couple of other players that we've seen in our lifetime, which is probably the greatest era of hurling ever. But for me, Joe was doing it on a team that needed him a lot more than any of the others needed that one particular person.
Yeah, and to contextualize this, I think it's important actually what you said there, to contextualize this from a Galway perspective. Shane, whoever you speak to later, they'll be able to contextualize just how good he was, his career. They'll give you an insight into that. But if you'll humour me here for a second, from a Galway perspective, to explain my kind of semi-relationship to Joe, when Joe Canning was Joe Canning's from the other side of Galway. I'm from Rahoon, which is out west. He's from Portumna, but he had family over our side of the town, so routinely you'd see him walking up the road, bouncing a hurl bouncing a sitter off the road, walking up outside our house. If I was in the front garden holding a hurl, he'd puck a ball into me. If I was in the front garden kicking a soccer ball, he'd tell me to go in and get my hurl. My first ever event I covered was the Web Summit. That was the first thing. I was a freelancer, sent him a clue what I was doing, working for local Galway papers. He picked me out and gave me a one-on-one interview, which was a massive thing for me at the time, right? I can remember 2006, I would say. Don't quote me on that. 2006, the county final, the really contentious county final, Portumna against Loughrea, inside in Sawtill in Pear Stadium. I can remember being in Sheridan's bar, famous bar in Knockcarra, after that game, and a good family friend of mine, they were coming to a brawl with somebody inside there because of the way Joe was treated in that game. He was earmarked as a teenager. That was a really a fiery final. I think there's YouTube footage going around of that game. I think there was a big mad comeback at the end. Loughrea came storming back into it. A couple of times Joe was pulled down. He got no free. And there was this was the expectation. This was the sense around Joe at this time within Galway. And so in many ways, Mick, to be honest, that was a level of billing. That was a level of hype that nobody could live up to. I'm talking the entire county, obsessed with this teenager. So that was 2006 was the year there was all this talk about what he's going to go in with Galway. He turned it down. There was there was rumours about, was it something to do with the club scene within Galway? There was all these rumours about the as in literally within the county rivalries. So before he's even come on there, he's coming over this cloud of kind of controversy, and then he bursts out. And the big day for me, there's 2 days that stand out in my memory. One is the Cork game when he just announced himself, and I was like, yeah, like this guy he's gonna be a star. He's gonna live up to the billing. The other one was 2008, I'd say, for Skibbon Cup final when he lost, and I think he hit 117 that day. Just a sensational performance. The way the striking that we've come to know, that was the first day when I was like, this guy just can't miss. When he strikes the ball properly, he can't miss. And it kind of makes me think, to a certain extent, I've seen, I've been, as sure all of us are, like looking over Twitter and seeing the reaction from a lot of people. And, people say, oh, isn't it, a shame nearly they only got one All-Ireland. And it baffles me slightly. I've been thinking about this a lot, Mick, because, with the Olympics going on right now, it started with me right for the NBA when, if you, again, humor me here for a second, there's all this talk about what would it mean for, a player like Chris Ball to finally get a ring. And I was like, why do we have to define his career by, a medal, by a ring? And the same thing again in the Olympics, the achievement in itself, a lot of this stuff is a pure luck. It's the side of a draw. It's, but in itself, you can judge a performance without having, these dead on metrics for what they've come out of. So I previously would have said, I think I've made this case before that, I don't know, did Joe Canning live up to the hype that we had around him? Because it was impossible to live up to. But in many ways, he did, right? I'm falling into this trap of kind of defining, he was expected to win many All-Irelands and he was expected to above and beyond. And a lot of that stuff is out of his control. But what he did, what he delivered for Galway again and again and again was just something to behold. And, it is like, as much as I was joking that, it's devastation and sadness that he's gone, it is also just pure privilege to have seen this guy, in his pomp, growing up with this hurler. And what, I think that you'll see what he meant for Galway will be reflected in the kind of sentiment that's around today.
Yeah, very well put. Like, there's loads of issues there that you bring up. I mean, the losing performances for me. I actually did a piece last year on the greatest losing performances in sport, and there was a few hurling in there, and I didn't include one by Joe that probably should have, just because it wasn't well known enough. I remember in 2009 when Clare won the under-21 All-Ireland, they played Galway in the semi-final that year. Galway just straight through to the semi-final. Joe hanging in there, and just waiting all year for the match. And I think he scored 4-9 that day, and they lost. And it was just one of those. He'd already played senior. He'd already had that brilliant game against Cork and so on. He was already an all-star. But at the same time, you talk about still the excitement of what could we get from this guy. And maybe that's a little bit what you're saying about living up to the hype, was that he was so good, so young. There wasn't really much where to go after that. Like, I definitely have been really impressed with him in the last kind of 5-6 years with how he's changed his game and he's become a different style of player. And I thought he was a brilliant centre forward, having been such a great full forward for so long. And that's maybe where he improved. But in terms of explosiveness, you can't really get much better than what he was doing in the early days. There's nowhere to go from there, Explain to me about the pressure he was under in Galway. As you talk about that hype, but another memory I have of Joe Canning that isn't as positive a one, I suppose. Like, my defining memory of him at a game will be from a very similar seat to the one I'm about to mention in Croke Park, where in the 2018 All-Ireland final, sitting beside my wife, who's a Galway fan, telling her that this was over when he took that free. And again, the sign of always what you say in football, what's a world-class player? Someone who, gets the bit between his teeth, grabs the grain by the scruff of the neck and just changes it on their own. There's plenty of Joe examples of that. But when he scored that free, absolute rocket. I remember Dermot Byrne saying, like, the ball was past him before he'd seen it. That's a really, really defining memory of me watching Joe Canning in person, but from a very similar seat in the 2013 Leinster final, where Dublin beat an abject Galway really that day. Yeah. And I remember just sitting around Galway fans, and it was a subject of laughter. I was there with a few of my old friends who'd be GAA fans, but not massive hurling fans, that went for the day to see the Dubs, and which was great in its own way. But there was Galway fans in there, and they were just losing it. Everything was hit it into Joe. That became a catchphrase that I had for years after that. It was like slagging Galway fans, really, because everything was just hit it into Joe. And it was as if these were people who did go to every game. These were people who did know what they were talking about. And it was as if they lost all reason, because the only thing that could be going wrong was we weren't getting Joe Canning enough ball, or we weren't hitting it in from like a corner back clearance that can go straight into his hand. Galway fans seemed to lose all logic when it came to Joe Canning and how much they needed him to do.
And like, that's totally fair. And oftentimes it was because he could actually do it, despite the fact that they had such lofty expectations. Frequently he delivered, and I do think there's a strand of this that it's a conversation for another day. But we definitely don't appreciate stars like this when they're at their pomp as much as we should. It's just a fact. Like the slurs that were thrown against Joe, like some of them were kind of scandalous, to be honest. Really, like because he did like the odd me, he wasn't afraid to have his say, which is just absolute nonsense, really, to be honest. And it would kind of sicken you when you see that sort of stuff. I definitely think there's a strand that we just do not appreciate these players when they come through initially. And he actually said, I remember this was early enough now when the infamous Web Summit when that was in Dublin, the final year when it was in Dublin. I remember he said to me when I spoke to him in that interview, I learned very early in my career it's 6 inches from a pat in the back and a kick up the arse. And so I think he was conscious of it too. I think he was definitely, even if you listen to the way he spoke today, he is very conscious of stuff that's said about him in the media and said about him online. I think actually, and I would say that probably hurt him to a certain extent. And whatever about like the pressure within Galway, I think that's a lot of that is driven from the context of where the county was at and this desperation to win an All Ireland. And he was seen as the saviour, the man who could deliver it. And in many ways he did. I think the defining image is always going to be the Tipperary point. And it's funny, I was just watching that back today. I'd forgotten that he hit the free short just before that, which in many ways makes what he did after all the more impressive. Can you imagine the mental strength it takes to drop a shot short like that, to know this is what we need? Ger Canning announcing this is a miracle shot, hitting it from out near the sideline, and somehow he managed to sink it. Johnny Cohen actually, when he's hand passing the ball back, you can see Tipperary know what's coming. They're all descending on Canning before the ball is even in his hands. They know what's coming and they still can't stop it, which is the ultimate mark of kind of a great hurler. And that's the stuff, he did that. We talk about clutch shots. That's the definition of clutch. And the amount of times Canning did that frequently. And it goes to, when you talk about perception, it's the same thing with the infamous Johnny Glynn interview. That's purely because, the Galway did have decent hurlers, decent other forwards, but none of them could live up to Joe Canning because it's just purely the level that he set. And at times, Joe Canning couldn't live up to Joe Canning, the hype of Joe Canning. And yet still, even within that, the level of performance was just remarkable, really.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of times. We won't go over everything. It's like if there's anything else you want to get in, work away. But there's you mentioned this like the way he treated you at that at that Web Summit thing, the way he dealt with the media over the years. I always thought that there was somebody that was a star from such an early age. I always thought there was a great humility to Joe Canning, and that I felt that he took leadership and responsibility in many ways, and was more than happy to be the guy who says, give me that ball, I'm going to put it over the bar and be the star on the pitch, but I always felt that he was a good leader. I know there was always David Burke, there was Fergal Moore, there was David Collins there was more than just him, but you felt like he was always the leader of the pack there, but always I thought did it with humility anyway. I remember he was working for I can't remember. I can't remember who it was for, but they were sponsoring events that I was involved in, and he was at a good few of them, and he was just doing he didn't want to be in a privileged position. So even though he was also a guest on the show, he was making sure he was doing his job. So he's putting out chairs and stuff like that. I remember a couple of times we were like, Joe, would you not leave that to someone else? You're actually on the show tonight. Like, you have to do this. It's not like you're not doing any work. You're still doing this. And he's like, the idea that it would be left to somebody else was horrifying to him, and that's just a sign of a great work ethic. And that's a tiny example of anything. But I also think that 14 years in the game, and we're kind of like saying goodbye to him on the national level now anyway. Hopefully we'll still see him for Portumna and different things. But I think somebody who is a good ambassador for the game and who will leave it in most people like Joe Canning and don't have really a bad word to say about him, and it isn't in this sort of scenario where they're like, oh, Galway and their superstar. And that could have easily been the case. And I know I'm in a very, very roundabout way of saying that that's as important to me as somebody who was the most talented player.
And I to be honest, the media stuff is interesting. Actually, I've sat in with a lot of. Probably one of the hurlers I've interviewed most, whether that be in a group setting or a one-on-one. And he definitely, he carries a chip on his shoulder. I remember he was was it 2 years ago? He went off injured against. Do you remember this? He went off injured against Waterford. He got rattled by a shoulder. And there was reports initially that it wasn't as bad. And he felt really wronged by those because to him it was this perception that, he it wasn't as bad. He'd gone down easy, and in reality, I mean, he done serious damage. And about 6 months later, I sat in another press conference in a hotel in Dublin, and he was going nuts about. That was when all the commentary was talking about the old style of hurling, and I remember we actually spoke about it, myself and yourself, after that, when he was saying, and he was very kind of blunt about this. He'd watched a lot of games. That was Galway had been knocked out by Dublin that year early on. He'd watched a lot of the old games on Air Sport, the classic games. And he said, these hurlers wouldn't live within the modern era. The way they use possession, they'd be torn off after 20 minutes. It was aimless. He was adamant, that hurling has come on leaps and bounds since then. He kind of took pride in that. And then, separate to all of that, Mick, right? There's the, whatever about like the media stuff. I find that entertaining. Whether or not sometimes he gets it wrong. Sometimes he might go a little far, but more often than not, I found him spot on. But separate to all of that is the, he was conscious of
2012 All Ireland final being the one where he maybe got it wrong.
Look, going over old wounds here now. I'm vulnerable enough as it is.
Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
But 2017, I was there's the passage that I put up on Twitter earlier today. But for people who don't know, 2017, the All Ireland final. And this was written about in Tony Keady, the biography. Liam Hayes wrote a very good biography, of Liam Hayes with his family. Of Tony Keady with his family, and. But this is Nirvana, right? This is what it's been building up to. This is the moment. So you got to take that in the context. This is the moment when finally Galway have gotten over the line. Joe Canning is there. He's in the midst of it. What's the first thing Joe Canning does? He spots Shannon, Tony Keady's only daughter. The two of them were, like that, utterly inseparable. He spots her by himself, makes his way over to her, gives her a hug. Galway go up to collect the trophy. Joe Canning stays down on the field beside her. The word is overused, but it's just a class act, like an absolute class act. That is where his mind was in that moment, at that time. The book goes into all the stuff he did actually for the family, both on the day and subsequently. But yeah, to my mind, that's the measure of Joe Canning. It's not only what he did on the field that day or that year, but what he did after the game. It's just, like as I said, it's pure.
It was so noticeable, wasn't it? Because David Burke gave such a brilliant speech that day, and the focus was there. And I just, every time it went down to the family, you could see like it's Joe Canning standing in the middle of them, and there they are on the field. And I remember being really struck by that. Actually, wrote up a piece today about the semi final that you spoke about. That's up on Balls.ie now. Can people read? But it was just mentioning the final very briefly at the end. The defining image was him there with the Keady family, and you're dead right about that. Darrell O'Dwyer saying pure genius. Nessa Coyne saying saddened by the news, but I'm not surprised. He's a great ambassador for the game of hurling, a true hero and huge loss to Galway in the game of hurling. Nessa's basically said everything I wanted to say, except it took me 15 minutes to say it, but a lot more succinctly than I did there. Martin Keane is saying legend as well, like, and plenty of comments coming in, much saying the same thing. It'll be a huge positive. Nessa also in saying thank you for your dedication and pure genius on the hurling pitch. Again, sort of saying everything I want to say. Like the legacy of what Joe Canning will mean to Galway, Morris. That's the hardest question I'll ask you today.
Yeah, so and ultimately, I don't know how we'll define that today. I think the fact that I was saying this to you earlier, the fact that this came after the week that was for Galway GAA, it only hardens the blow. We don't know where either of these teams are, and then suddenly the greatest hurler that Galway has ever known walks away. It's just, in many ways it'll feel like rock bottom, and I think that will emphasize. There is definitely. There's a different conversation we'll have another day about the need for change within this Galway hurling team and what they need to do with their squad. And, I do think that I personally had a feeling at the weekend this was the end of an era. Before this news came out, before there was any rumours, I personally felt that this was, it's something had to change. It did feel like this team has done so much, been probably the most consistent Galway team of my lifetime, but definitely in an era. Now, that's a separate conversation, because what we're talking about here is but Joe Canning's career. And I do, as much as I was joking about the sadness and how much we'll miss what he did, I do hope that over the next few days there is kind of a cause for celebration about all he gave. It's as minor moments as him sticking a sideline over the bar against Limerick in just farcical terms. I think I read today 27 sidelines. Joe Canning scored like 27 sidelines. I think the nearest is 8. Like So it's freakish, it's absolutely freakish, and that to my mind, that's the stuff that will live long in the memories. It's not only the accolades and All-Stars and the All-Ireland. It's the little kind of moments of just pure genius. And that's what he was, ultimately. He was like an absolute, again, another word that's probably overused, but he was, in the truest sense of the term, a genius on the field.
Yeah, absolutely. The Ball's Twitter account, you can see his 2015 goal against Kilkenny, which I thought was pure genius. People will remember.
That's the twist. Unbelievable. Yeah,
there's kind of like there's the odd thing that you'll see, which is amazing skill, and the odd thing that might be through pace or through different things that are, oh, what a goal, I've never seen anything like it. But then there's other ones where you say there's not many people who could actually do, you wouldn't even think that you could do, never mind actually try it in a championship game against Kilkenny. And that's one of them. People will also remember the sideline cut in the All-Ireland final that the fan got the best view of ever, where you could just follow it all the way over the bar. You're talking about, and there's countless others. Like, I mean, just again, the one I mentioned against Limerick in the All-Ireland final that I think in defeat will be forgot about a little bit, but again, the moment that was, and of course that point against Tipperary. But look, Joe Canning is leaving us with a lot to celebrate, I think, Maurice. I think that's a very, very good point. I also, the sadness, I think, is there across the country. I think for Galway, I think it is hard to imagine losing a player like that, because even if you could never win a match, I was talking to Shane last week about Tony Kelly, and I'm like, if Clare never win another match, I can always say, at least I get to watch Tony Kelly every year and hear from him, and I mean, and I'm hopefully got another 3-4 years of that, if not longer, to come. And that's what Galway fans had with Joe Canning, and for so long, and it's a privilege as a neutral, but I can only imagine what it was like as a fan, and it's a hard thing to lose on any day. And you mentioned then like how hard that is. There was a moment on Saturday when the game was gone away from them completely, where I saw one tweet actually from somebody saying, I hope Joe gets this record now so he can go away and retire in peace. And I remember I was pissed off, and I was like, oh, this is like, the knives are out for him, nobody's ever satisfied, no, eating bread is soon forgotten, and also this isn't his fault, he's not and I saw a follow-up tweet from the same person later on in a completely different way. He didn't realize I was sitting there fuming, misunderstanding his tweet, but he was actually having a go at the rest of Galway and saying Joe doesn't deserve to have to be part of this anymore, and it was big of the whole team. And I figured that out from the subsequent tweet, but I'm just there thinking to myself, it's like, I tweeted actually about the knives being out for him after the game, and it didn't happen. People have got to that point now where I think they appreciate everything that's happened, and hopefully, to your point, that we can spend the next week celebrating rather than, as you said, worrying about how many medals he won. He still did win and all. He led Galway to their only All-Ireland in the last 30 odd years as well. Let's not forget that it wasn't nothing to actually win one.
And it's funny, two things there, Mick, right? Firstly, you mentioned the Kilkenny goal. Like, I just spent the last whatever it was hour and a half going over my this memory bank that I have of Joe Canning memories. I was sitting behind that goal, and that moment didn't even come to my mind until you mentioned it there. I probably one of the best viewers in the country, and it just goes to show the amount of stuff that he gave to Galway. And separately, to my mind, there was Galway saw three versions of Joe Canning, right? And I do think it's important when you're contextualizing his career, because each one of them was kind of pivotal. There was the initial, just outgunning, shoot the lights out, Joe Canning. There was the second version when they were trying to incorporate more forwards. He came slightly out the field. It wasn't to hit it into Joe, maybe it was slightly lessened. And then there was a third version, which we saw, I think, most successfully last year, which is Joe the creator. And that's what he was. I actually did analysis of this after the Leinster final when they lost to Kilkenny. And just go back and look at those stats after that game. Go back and look at his turnovers, his accuracy of passes, his distribution of the ball. Do you remember in that game the sideline pass hit from Mannion? Mannion coming straight down the middle. He was in and under Hogan's hand. He hit a pinpoint perfect pass straight into Mannion's hand as he was tearing down through the middle. Mannion put the ball over the bar, and it was really subtle. But that was the reason he was doing that, right? Modern hurling, the warfare, the battle in that middle third, that's where the game is defined now. So if you can bring a bit of class into that area, and in that kind of trench warfare, somebody who can distribute the ball accurately, it is just vital. That is a lifeline for teams. And he tried to do that. And the greatest measure, to my mind, the greatest measure of a great player is, you mentioned Tony Kelly earlier, a guy who can be on the fringe of a game for 90% of it. The weekend, I honestly, I don't know. Joe Canning's in terms of his touches in the first half, they might have been single fingers, I'd say, to be honest. In play. But when Galway are coming for a comeback, they desperately need something out of nothing. He'll muster up the pass for Jason Flynn's goal. And there was times the pure lack of ego in his play.
Yes.
I'm sure he was conscious of that record. I'm sure. Yeah. I have absolutely no doubt actually that he was conscious of that record. And yet still he's a free and he spots a man in a better position. A free he could score and he gives the ball off.
It was actually open play. He did the same from a free a few minutes before. I think he did a quick one, wasn't it? Maybe I'm confused now. Maybe you're right. Maybe it was a free. I think he had done the same from open play as well. Easy point. He gave up 3 scores though in that game, 3 easy scores on a day when he was chasing the record, all before he got the record, and when Galway were well beaten. I think only Joe Canning and maybe a few others believed that they could come back into it, and they very nearly did. But that was the day to tap him over and get that record and say, one for me, I've given loads to the team. And he never did that. And I wouldn't expect him to either, but I also think it's worth pointing out,
Yeah, I kind of would expect him, and that's just because the level he has set previously. I can't, there was definitely a part of me that's thinking, "Oh, here we go," the Galway finally got fire.
I expect him to take the easy score.
Sorry.
I'm saying I wouldn't expect him to do that, but I also think it's worth mentioning the game was as good as done in most people's eyes, and yet he was foregoing those easy frees for that bit of magic that he was trying to find to get them going.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, there is definitely a part of me that is very glad that he got the records, of course, because I think it is ultimately deserved. But it's the most Joe Canning thing ever that in a game when he breaks the scoring record, the thing we'll remember most is Joe the Creator, laying on passes for Jason Flynn and everything else he did, within that. I think it's fitting, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fitting also that we got to speak to you tonight, Maurice. Tonight, your time, obviously. You can go to bed now, having had that 27-minute counselling session with me. I hope you feel a bit better after it. We're gone now. We've gone from commiserations to celebrations in that time. Hopefully, my own thoughts will be a little bit less flustered a little bit later on when we come back and speak to Shane McGrath and a couple of others, because this news is actually, as a complete neutral, just a hurling fan, it's actually hit me. So I can only imagine what you're going through, Maurice, but thanks a million for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for the support, Mick.
Always there for you, man. Always there for you. That's Maurice Brosnan from he's in Melbourne, going to bed, and very sad tonight over Joe Canning's retirement from Intercounty Hurling. We'll have more reaction to this massive news on a GAA Embedded special that we're doing a little bit later on. As I said, we'll have a regular guest, Shane McGrath, with us, and we'll have a couple more surprise guests too. See you now.